Uh, Hi, I'm Pastor Theron. Welcome to Church Where You Are and Story Sermons, relating life's experiences to the Bible. I'd like to tell you a story. But first, I'd like to say a special word of welcome and thanks to some very important people to me, some preachers that I've known through the years, including the very, very first one that I ever sat under was a man by the name of Pastor Barber in Lewiston. In the rare times we went to church when I was a kid, that's who we sat under, and I appreciate him even to this day as my very first introduction and inspiration of who and what a preacher ought to be. For those preachers that I sat under in Kansas while I was on active duty, right after I was saved, in the Church of the One, and I don't even remember their names, but I appreciate them and their instruction to me in the times that I attended, and all the way up to today, and the pastor that is still a good friend, Pastor Todd, there in Lake Charles. I appreciate him and his instruction and his passion and his just genuine heart, and really enjoy chatting with him and all the people that have helped me through the years. This story in particular is about the first pastor that I ever called my own, and his name's Monty Holloway. He's not with us anymore. He's gone on to be with the Lord. But right after I got saved in December of '93, I started attending. I was attending a sort of a non-denominational Pentecostal church in those days, and I learned that there were different kinds of religions and denominations. I didn't know, and so I started attending a Baptist church there in Junction City, Kansas, and attended a few times. We spent most of that first year out in the field. But I was an infantry soldier serving with the 1st Infantry Division, Fort Riley, Kansas, and I was about to get married and looking forward to that. I was about to get out of the Army, out of active duty, and so in July of 1994, I got married, and we promptly moved to my hometown of Lewiston, Idaho. My wife then looked in the Yellow Pages and found a Southern Baptist church there in Lewiston, a place called Orchards Baptist Church, right there on the corner of Bryden, and we lived in the Orchards anyway, and so we started attending church there, and the pastor, named Monty Holloway, as it would turn out, had been an airborne infantry guy, and we got along great. His family really just accepted us in. I learned what it looked like to be a church member. I learned what it looked like to have a church family. And if you don't have one of those, I highly encourage you. You know, there's a message on this on YouTube and on Facebook about my dealings, thinking I was a Lone Ranger Christian. We are not called to be Lone Ranger Christians. We are called to have a family, a network, and very often you can find that within your local church. You're never going to find a perfect church, but you're going to find one that loves you and accepts you just as you are. I would highly encourage you to have a church family, so that, especially in those times of difficulty and struggle, you have someone that will rally around you and support you and pray for you. And I absolutely believe that, and believe everybody ought to be plugged in somewhere. That's why I'm so appreciative of all of these guys that I have learned from and sat under for all these years. Back to the story. As we would attend, this is the church that I told you about a couple weeks ago, where I felt the call to preach, and Pastor Monty said, I'm going to be gone next week, going to have a guest speaker, which is unfortunate because sometimes I'd like to hear somebody else preach too. And that's when the voice said to me, why don't you do it? And I went forward and talked to him, and he said, well, maybe God's calling you to preach. I said, okay. I didn't know what else to think about it anyway. Well, as fortune would have it, as God would have it, not only was he a former infantry guy, so we spoke the same language, not only was his family very supportive and loving to us, their daughter, Beth, loved our young son, William, and would babysit for us and would watch him for us. We were invited to his house. We would eat with them and with Monty and his family. It was just a really, really good, supportive environment. But as this developed, as this idea of me becoming a preacher developed, I went to him one day and I said, I don't even know how to get started in something like this. And somewhere along in the way, he said, you know, I promised God that if he ever had me in a church and a young man came to me and said, I feel led to be a preacher. I would surrender my pulpit for the Sunday or whatever and help him develop his sermon and help a young preacher get started. It's not by accident that he was the one that all this happened under, because the opposite is true as well. I've served under preachers, not as the preacher of a church, just as a member, and went to them and said, hey, I feel led to preach. And they were like, that's nice. And one preacher even said, you will never preach in this church as long as I'm here. That's another story for another day. But it does happen. It just so happened, and God saw fit, that I was in the church with Monty and his family, and so he granted me the opportunity to speak to his congregation from his pulpit, or the word pulpit means sacred desk. So and I know as a preacher that it's very, very difficult for a preacher to relinquish that kind of control, because you are responsible for your flock. You are responsible for that congregation. You are responsible for what is said behind this sacred desk. You are responsible for the truth or the hypocrisy that is spoken within the church. And we as preachers are held to a higher calling, a higher standard, because of the calling that God has placed on our lives. And Monty was willing to risk that for this young guy who came to him and said, I feel like God may be calling me to be a preacher. I didn't even know the words to use. And so as weeks went by, I began putting together a sermon. Had no formal education. I had barely begun college even. And yet the Bible that I was reading was all marked up. I had highlighter marks, and I had ink lines, and I had notes in the margins, and I mean, the cover was falling off. These were in the days when I was reading 4 and 5 devotionals a night and just hungry for the word. I just couldn't get enough. And I prayed earnestly, what do I do? What do I speak on? What should my topic be? Because I didn't even know how to frame the words together. And God led me to a passage in the Gospels, and that's another story for another day too. And I'll share with you my very first sermon one of these days. But it's the story of Jesus calming the storm. Oddly enough, I have the notes from my very first sermon, and I still use those notes from my very first sermon when I share it with a church that I might be serving in, or a time when I want to let people know this story. But I want to tell you the rest of the story, not just the passage and the sermon. I want you to know how it all unfolded. I went to the church that Sunday morning. That was in July of '96, just a couple months after I even felt the call. I was nervous. I was scared. I didn't know what I was getting myself into. You know, I'm about to stand up in front of the church and deliver this address. I had seen other guys do it, even in the same church. Monty gave them opportunities. But now it was my turn, and I was nervous, man. It was scary. And so I sat in the Sunday school room. I remember this. There was a rocking chair in there, and my buddy Daryl, who had come to hear my very first sermon, he said, why don't you sit in the rocking chair? His dad was also a preacher, and he said something along the lines of, I was told that rocking helps calm you. I don't know if that's true or not, but it sure helped, because I was rocking in the chair, just trying to calm down. I didn't know what to do. I was scared. My heart was racing. I was sweating. Oh, it was mind numbing. I can't even describe it. So we got through the opening hymns and the opening remarks, and I think it was a great role reversal in the sense that I didn't read the passage of the day. Monty, the pastor, did that, and I was going to be the preacher, and so there was this interesting role reversal between the two of us, and he was so encouraging through the whole thing. You know, just kept telling me, "You're going to be fine. You know, God's going to bless it. God's going to honor it," and all this. And so I get out of the rocking chair and I go and I sit in the pew, and I'm just waiting my turn. I'm just nervous as anything, waiting for the hymns to be over. I had this great sermon, or so I thought, really well thought out, really well written out, really great punchline to deliver near the end. I'll share it with you one of these days. And I had it figured, a sermon for a church, as far as I'm concerned, about 20 to 30 minutes. These Facebook videos are a little shorter than that, but on YouTube you'll find some of my Bible studies and other sermons, and they're between 20 and 30 minutes, and even in the churches I've served in, that's about right. And I had it figured at about 20 minutes, 25 minutes, because I had rehearsed it. Because that's what you do before you give a speech. You rehearse it. And so I'm looking over my notes, and I got up behind the pulpit, and I thanked everybody in the audience as I'd seen high-ranking officers do in the military at formal banquets and award ceremonies, and you greet everybody in the front row, and you make recognitions of the important people in the audience, and I did all that. And then I started into my sermon, and I remember glowing. I just felt like I was glowing red like a Coke machine. Just I couldn't stand it. I was just baking inside of my own skin in my sport jacket. I didn't know what to do. And so I launched into this tirade of my best sermon ever. My first sermon ever. This thing that I had spent weeks on with mentorship. Had it figured at about 20, 25 minutes. I was done in 8.5 minutes and didn't know what else to say. So Monty calmly got up out of the front pew and stood beside me with his arm around me and sort of summed it up again and covered all the bases again and related the text to everybody again and then extended an invitation again. And somehow we made it to the 25-minute mark. I just rapid-fired through that message so fast, and I was just glowing hot red. I didn't know what else to do, but that is how it all got started. The Bible says in Zechariah, don't despise the day of small beginnings. Now, all these years later, 25 years later, I'm still doing it. In fact, this is middle May 2021, and so almost 25 years to the day later, I'm still doing it. I've learned a few things. I still get nervous. I still take this responsibility very, very highly and hope and pray that God blesses it each and every time. I hope and pray that the words even that I share here on Facebook and on YouTube with y'all and tell these stories and relate it back to the Bible, we should never forget how these small beginnings happen. We should never forget that God takes our best efforts and blesses them and grows them. We should never forget that every beginning starts as a very small beginning, a very simple beginning. You might be scared. You might be nervous. I would encourage you just as he did for me. Get up there and do it. God's going to bless it. If you're called to do it, then do it with all your heart. If it's preaching, if it's teaching, if it's counseling, if it's helping, if it's mentoring, go and do it with all your heart. If it's something simple like working at a fast food place or a gas station or whatever you're doing, do it with all your heart. Don't look down on the things that you do daily around the house. Don't look down on the things, the big things like raising kids and taking care of your spouse and running your household. Don't look down on those things and say, I'm not doing much. Do it with all your heart because God has called you to it. Thanks for watching.